Hi everyone. Today's dissertation is called From Ecology to Architecture, the notion of human habitat as an interdisciplinary model in the pedagogy of the design of the built environment. I'm Daniel Marin Vanegas, and I have been advised by Professor Jorge Montoya, that is the coordinator of the doctoral program in Human and Social Sciences, John Munoz, that is the head of School of Habitat, and Ricardo Benavides, a professor from the San Buenaventura University. This is part of a project that is called Pedagogical Model for Teaching Habitat Intervention Design in Higher Education Programs, and is funded by the National University of Colombia. And this is, of course, part of the conference that summons us today, the Sixteenth International Conference on Design Principles and Practice, held in Newcastle, Australia. Here is the presentation structure that will be divided in three main sections. These are the first one, the conceptualization, related to knowing what we are facing and understanding it, and is related to two chronologies, the path of human habitat concept and the path of integrated sustainability. The second section is contextualization, related to knowing why to face the problem, and is the justification, and it has to be with frameworks. First, frameworks for inter and that transdisciplinary approaches of the human and built environment concepts, and then the frameworks for multidimensional habitat and project life cycle. And at last, the third section that is called implementation, related to knowing how to deal with this problem or this situation, and it has to be with models. The first models for typologies for sustainable intervention design, and then the pedagogical model in an 8 bachelor program's blended course. At last, we have our outcomes that are the students' implementation of the model, and then the conclusion, that is the complex human intervention in nature. And all these three sections has to be with classical types of knowledge production: know how, know why, know what. Thanks. So let's begin. Conceptualization, the path of the notion of human habitat, a twofold timeline: habitat versus dwelling. At the very beginning, the notion of habitat was coined in the field of biological sciences, specifically in ecology, by some scientists like Grinnell and Leopold, as a synonym of niche, ecological niche, as meaning, I quote, the place where an organism lives. But simultaneously, the use of the concept of dwelling, human dwelling, have been used since the midterm of the 14th century, meaning place of residence, habitation, and abode. Then the notion of biological community was coined by Eugene Doom, an ecologist, in the midterms of the last century. And then some others, ecologists like Hutchinson and Doberman, have defined habitat as a place of appropriate conditions for an organism, species, or animal or plant community to live. But also, in the other path of the dwelling concept, in the midterm of the last century, the concepts of decent and adequate housing were added in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Then we started in the 1990s and the last years of the 20th century to approach to a multidimensional scope of habitat that is defined by Odum as including not only the physical space that the organism occupies, but also its functional roles in the biological community and some gradients like pH, like temperature or moisture and humidity and so on. But at the same time, in the urban rural studies and planning sciences, the landscape of urbanism in housing were added to the concept of dwelling. So we started to talk about environmental design, greenhouses. Some examples we have searched in 1982. But at last, nowadays, we have the concept of built environment. considered as an interdiscipline by Chinweb in 2006 and by some other scientists for sustainable development like Holsworth and Orana in 2014. But we want to highlight here the beginning of the usage of the concept of human habitat in the first conference of habitat held in Vancouver, Canada in 1976 and held by the United Nations Human Settlement Program, UN Habitat. Uh, that's the moment when we in humanity began to use the notion of human habitat, not only ecological habitat, and now this is an holistic approach to relate the built environment of the human, but also the nature environment that are not different. So let's move on the second path, the path of integrated sustainability. The current integrated sustainability consists of 5 dimensions. The first one, the economy, before the Brundtland report, when the projects were only related to the spatial and material dimension or focused, and the economy dimension. But then in 1987, the global agenda had added the environment to the sustainability. And after the Brundtland report, we began to think of sustainable projects, sustainable human development, and interventions. Then the society was added as living and dynamic spaces since the 90s, and a third dimension of the integrated sustainability. And this century, the 20th century, the culture was added as the fourth pillar of integrated sustainability. But the last years in this century, we have found that the latest advances in integrated sustainability have added the institutionality as the fifth dimension of this complex concept. Now we will begin with the second section, contextualization. The built environment and habitat as inter and transdisciplinary approaches, respectively. So here we have an explanation that we have made about the disciplinary dynamics. So we have the disciplinary approach, an example with architecture, that is an specialization in isolation, is the classical and traditional knowledge mode of production. And then we have the multidisciplinary approach, that is the existence of multiple disciplines without cooperation, without interaction and dialogue between them. So then we have the interdisciplinary approach. So that means cooperation across disciplines, sharing of methodologies, concepts, and theories that allow these disciplines to become a new interdiscipline, an emergency. For instance, we have the built environment as an interdiscipline, and some the disciplines that are communicated to get this outcome. So human sciences, architecture, design, ecology, and the STEM, including engineering. And at last, we have the transdisciplinary approach, where it's located the habitat concept that we are talking about today. So here we have in an universal set, a three-set Venn diagram, where each sphere represents discipline, and the intersections between disciplines are interdisciplines. So getting all of these joined, we become the transdiscipline when the application and implementation of these academic knowledges produced in educational institutions is applied to the real world, to problems of real world where there are societal actors and communities of practices. So the second part of the contextualization is like the habitat approach from the ecology. So in ecology, there is a study. There are some studies for systems hierarchies that are coined by Barrett and Odum, some of the main ecologies of the last centuries. So we have first the ecosphere scale, then the biome, the landscapes, the ecosystems, the community, the biological community, and here we have found that the scale of habitat is in between the community and the population in biological sciences, but also the scale of human habitat. So here we have like the hierarchy applied to the human habitat discipline. So the last part of this contextualization of built environment and habitat as IBTD approaches, we have the schema that have been built by China in 2005 that situates the interdiscipline of built environment in between this area that you can see in the schema. So here we have a diagram of 4 quadrants when we can see the hard and the soft sciences or modes of knowledge and the pure and applied sciences. So the built environment is located in the area related to disciplines like design, law, economics, technology, and management. So remember, this is the interdisciplinary approach. So as you remember, the second frameworks in the section of contextualization were the multidimensional frameworks for habitat. So the first development was made in 2018 by our team, and here we have a nodes and rhizome based model from the rhizomatic model of Deleuze and Guattari. So we have the human habitat and center, and then some spheres and nodes that represent the different language definitions of habitat. So we have the biologic environmental acception, that is the ecological one that we have presented to you. We have the functional utilitarian acception that is related to the spatial and material dimension. It's the traditional approach from urban studies. And then we have the sociocultural acception, where the dimensions of cultural and social facts comes abroad. So then we have the last year model that our framework that we have developed in the team of our project, that is as an stack Ben-based model and also based on Simondon's transduction concept. So here we have different layers of an chronology of the universe evolution in planet Earth and also the human evolution. So here we have the first layer, that is the physical and material dimension. Then we have the development of the development of the atoms and the constitution of the environment. That is called ambiental in Spanish. But then throughout many years of evolution, the emergence of life comes about with the emergence of the biological dimension. So we have biological individuals that, when they associate to reach a common purpose like food or protection, they become social individuals. And then the mammals, like the proto-humans and the other social individuals, animals, when they began to modify the nature to interact with the matter and the environment, the culture dimension comes abroad. So the culture is in humanity, and then a lot of different dimensions, several dimensions, become to be developed, and as a new evolution, as some anthropologists call the second nature, but nature at all. So here we have a boundary. We are here nowadays, but there are a universal diagram of Venn that means there are all the dimensions that will appear throughout the years. So the last part of this second section of contextualization is the model development from the life cycle of the projects after the Project Management Institute. So we know that the PMI have stated 5 phases for the project's management, that are initiation, planning, execution, controlling, and closing. So here, the School of Construction in our college have made some questions that are in planning phase. There are some building designs like architectural, structural, technical, but the School of Construction have made a question. Are designs only made in the planning phase of construction projects? So the answer was no. So the concept of execution design of the construction site was coined by some professors of our school. So then with a method, with an analogy as a method, coined or developed by Simon Dons and Professor Jorge Montoya. We created like an analogy for a new management phase of the project. That is the occupation or use phase. And then the concept of intervention design of the human habitat comes abroad. So the purpose is to reach a pedagogical model of the methodology, a new handbook for the education of all these related disciplines. So we have that material intervention is different from the multidimensional intervention. And we have that there are 6 different dimensions, but the main they are can be summarized as 3 couples: spatial, material, sociocultural, and biologic environmental, to converge in the complex or multidimensional intervention. So here we have our last section of implementation before showing our outcomes. So here is our background and antecedents in the typologies for sustainable intervention. So from the 4 main dimensions of integrated sustainability, we have overlap in a Venn diagram the intersections of these main dimensions that results on different types of intervention depending on what we want to deal with. So we have the resource intervention in between the intersection of economy and environment. We have socioeconomic intervention in the relationship of economy and society. We have communicational intervention in the interaction of society and culture. And we have environmental intervention, and we have a note here, both the nature environment and the built environment. That is to say, we are intervening both the human-oriented spaces and the nature-oriented ones, because they are both nature. The artificial world created by the human is also nature. So here we have the intervention design process, like with a technique for memorizing 3DC. That is to say, this process consists on a diagnostic, the first D, a dialogue, so a diagnostic about the study cases for intervention, then the dialogue between actors, both the academic actors in interdisciplinary teams, but also social actors in the real world. That is a transdisciplinary approach. Then we have the 3D, the third D, a decision has to be made about a change, the Z. What kind of change? We have an example here. If we will intervene a rural community and we will move them to a new housing project, an urban electric and gas stove is different, for example, from a rural wood stove. So we have to make a decision here. Change in the design or a change in the habit. So the methodology consists on the designing for a change in the intervention design, the project itself, or in the ways of living of users. That is to say, the lifestyles. So here we have that design for change is based on 2 options: a change in the housing design, the spatial material dimension, that is the traditional approach, or a change in the ways of living, that is the communication dimension, that needs a training for users to acquire new habits. So the methodology statement, like main statement, is to design for the change of equal combination between the habitats dimensions. So at last, we want to present our study case, that is the 8 bachelor programs blended course. Here we have 6 teams with 8 different disciplines, and each of these teams have at least 5 different disciplines or students from different bachelor programs. So the first team are working in an intervention of Parque RB ecological park. The second team is studying the cultural and scientific park that will be built in the next years in Moravia. Also, we have a team focused in the cable railway, a team that is working on an electric railway, a team that is working on a highway bridge that connect different neighborhoods in the city of Medellin, and other group working on an electric railway. So these are 6 different infrastructure projects that are considered as interventions in the city of Medellin, and allow us to land in reality, real world problems, be implementing the methodology. So the implementation of the model have some levels of study, from the dimension to the variable. Here we have the dimension related to the theory, that is from global to local approach. The category, that is related to the concept, that is from the general to the particular. And then we have the variables that are related or has to do with the practice, from the theory to the practice. So we have the solution from the models for complex intervention. The methodology consists on the selection of a main critical dimension or an intervention dimension, and then the impact that other dimensions can suffer with this intervention. So, for example, if a team select a spatial material intervention, the sociocultural and the biological environmental dimensions will be affected. So this selection also consider the impact in other dimensions and is not the traditional insight that is focused only in one dimension, in only dimensional approach. So another example we have is like a political institutional intervention with regulations, parameters for the communities, has an impact on all dimensions, because it has to be with the legitimacy and the community acceptance about those regulations. And also the communicational intervention has an impact on all the dimensions and requires the user's training for the change, for acquiring new habits. So at last, we have our outcomes, the integrated methods. So we have 8 different visual programs, and each of them have brought to the course a method from the disciplines. So we have some methods for the problem understanding and some other methods from the solution implementation. So you can see the development of the studies. So the integrated methods that were developed in our course are here. Here we have a model of occupation of a neighborhood, but also a method that shows the integration of different dimensions of the model of the habitat that we have presented to us, to you. We have the morphology of a neighborhood, the typology, the technology, and an image. These are related, the first one with the physical and environmental dimensions of habitat. Then the typology and the technology are related with the cultural and sociocultural dimensions, and the image is related with the aesthetics and some other abstract dimensions of the habitat in the case of a study of the ecological park. And then we have here a pretty useful integrated method that is the layers analysis of architecture mixed with some qualitative information analysis from political sciences, from civil engineering. And so here we have the topography. I will turn on our pointer. Yeah, here we have the topography, that is the environmental dimension. Then we have the infrastructure of the built environment. Then we have the built environment itself, the system of the build, they say here. And then we have the intervention project, that is the bridge, the highway bridge in Santa Madre Laura in Medellin. And then we have the dimension of sociocultural facts with some data gathered from interviews and surveys. So another integrated method is this one that shown different institutions. So it's related with the political institutional dimension of habitat of the model. We have some equipments, like some projects with cultural services, like this Centro Cultural de Moravia, or some education institutions. And at last, we have an integrated method that is an implementation of the model explained in the course. That is the heuristic framework elaborated based on Bieni et al. Development, and is a three main dimensions framework, and it's applied to the case of the study of Ayacucho Railway. So they locate or situate the project in place and time. Also, they delimited the project itself, the project of intervention, and here they have the used methods in architecture, layer analysis for the understanding of the problem, and then the Besser's matrix, that is for the solution implementation of the problem of the case study. And then we have the delimitation of the institutional and native actors. So let's move on our conclusions. From dwelling on human habitat, dwelling approach is a commercial one that leads to deficiencies in designs that are expressed or demonstrated by the change of use, like a residential use of an architectonic project becomes a commercial use one. For example, some housing projects, residential use, suffered changes of use because of the transformation and occupation of the inhabitants. There are some deficiencies in management because the traditional approach doesn't have a use phase of the management of the projects, and we have that the dwelling approach is a unidimensional approach that is only focused in the economic dimension and the spatial and material dimension. So we fosters a transition towards an human habitat approach that is a complex one, and where the occupancy and use management is present, and the management for the change and change management and training is also present. So this multidimensional approach is related with the integrated sustainability that we have shown to you, and the different types of intervention. So here we want to state that the occupation of the projects of the habitat cause change of use that are spatial material modifications due to sociocultural practices, as you can see here. Thus, our main dissertation here is the meaning of the complex human intervention in nature. What does that mean at all? Here we have a starting point with the human ancestors, like Lucy, 2 million of years ago. We had an pre-individual entity constituted by matter as a term and primates as the second term. They were separate entities, but then throughout all the millions of years of evolution process, a relation started. That is the relationship between technique and Homo sapiens, constituted in what we call a transductive relation. That is to say, a relation in between the terms are constituted themselves in the process of interaction. Before this relationship, these terms does not exist at all. So technique and Homo sapiens only appear as an interaction of matter and the primates. And here is where we can observe the emergence of the built environment, the human design world. The current condition nowadays is that we have an individual, inseparable entity constituted by the habitat, what is built, and the human beings. So we have, in simple words, the pure meaning of individual. That is a dual matter and primates that became indivisible, and is what we call today habitat. So our last conclusion here is that the human nature is not separate from the rest of the nature, and all this holistic approach can help us to design a better world for human-oriented space, but also nature-oriented ones. That's all, people. Here you can check out the references of each of the sections presented in our conference. Here we have the references for timeline 1, here the references for timeline 2, then we have the second section references for our frameworks in inter and transdisciplinarity, and of course our background in the references in the frameworks for multidimensional habitat, our base in the development of the life cycle model, and at last in the section 3, these are our background and antecedents in the pedagogical model. Last but not least, the list of the students involved in our course and the reference for the base of the heuristic model. That's all for today, people. Here you can check out our contact data and you can follow our project in ResearchGate with this link or title. Have a good year.